Hi, and welcome to How to APA, the Essentials of Formatting and Citing, co-sponsored by the Faculty of Graduate Studies at Athabasca University and the Right Site. For each component of APA style today, we'll touch briefly on its purpose so you can understand why you have to use these guidelines. We'll learn how to format an APA title page and headings, as well as other aspects like an abstract. We'll review how to cite, whether paraphrasing or quoting, as well as how to create a reference page and the references that accompany it. And I'll also give you some tips for how you can use resources like those on your handout to find answers to your many APA questions. Finally, I'll give you a challenge. If you pay close attention to my APA style throughout this presentation, you may learn some additional things. So now let's go over the essentials of formatting. After discussing the purpose, we'll cover title pages, abstracts, headings, and figures and tables. Our handout lists the sources and tools that you may want to review, such as sample papers. So why do you have to use APA style? Well, first of all, APA stands for American Psychological Association, and they've put together their own guidelines on formatting to provide a standardized way to format documents in psychology and many other fields of study. These guidelines can apply to anything from journal articles to student papers, and they're flexible, so content could be methodological, theoretical, or case study. They've really tried to make it a flexible style so it will fit all these different types of academic papers. I find that the headings, which we'll talk about, are one of the things that make it so flexible. And the rules are based in part on readability of the text. APA has also placed a lot of emphasis on accessibility in their 7th edition. For example, APA accommodates sans serif fonts like 11-point Calibri or Arial, which are more universally readable, while the preference for print work used to be only serif fonts like 12-point Times New Roman. Both are now acceptable. Here's what a sample title page looks like, and you can find this sample linked to in our handout. I'll just point out a few things. Student papers no longer require a running head. I've worked with many students who had difficulties with that part of the formatting. Your assignment may occasionally require a running head, so check with your instructor if you're not sure, particularly in graduate school. You can also contact the Right Site if you have any difficulty with formatting your running head, and we can walk you through it. And notice that we do still have a page number in the upper right-hand corner, and you can see that the number on the title page is actually 1. The title is centered and bolded, and it uses what we call title case capitalization. So all the major words, nouns, verbs, adjectives, and any word 4 or more letters will be capitalized, while articles and short prepositions should be lowercase, as seen with the word for in this example. You'll also see that the title is 3 to 4 lines down from the top of the page. We want to draw attention to the title, so we even have this space underneath the title to separate it and give it emphasis. The other items you could think of as your publication information. When you read an article, it will state at the beginning the volume, the issue, the journal title, as well as the authors and the date. Similarly, this is your publication information: your name, where you're from, what course you're taking, who you're writing this for, and the date. You can also think of submitting your paper as a sort of publication with at least one reader, your professor. This is again why we format consistently. In terms of abstracts, APA does not require abstracts for student papers, but you may need to write an abstract for your thesis or dissertation, as well as if your professor asks for one, and of course if you're submitting a paper for publication to a journal. So the purpose of an abstract is to summarize your paper after you've written it. This means to focus on the material that you've written to give potential readers an idea of what to expect and whether the paper is relevant to their research. Therefore, it isn't typical to cite others in your abstract, although it sometimes is done. Usually the abstract includes the research problem, hypothesis, methodology, and findings. The abstract comes at the beginning of your paper. You can see we're now on page 2, directly after the title page. And one thing about an abstract that is different compared to the body of your paper is that the first line of the paragraph is not indented. But the abstract heading has the same bold, centered, capitalized formatting as the title of your paper and other Level 1 headings. I really like to encourage students to use headings because they make organization really simple for you. So again, we see that centered, bold, title case capitalized heading for the most important sections of your paper, known as Level 1. So if you've got 3 different topics you want to discuss in the paper, it could be useful to be able to tell the reader which topic you're currently on. An example would be if you include a literature review as part of a longer paper, you would use a Level 1 heading to identify the literature review as one of your main sections, and this helps both writer and reader to know where they're at. Now, you shouldn't use an introduction heading in APA. Instead, on your first page of text, you will restate your title as a Level 1 heading that is centered and bolded with title case capitalization. You'll do the same for your first major section. And if you have a subsection within that section, that's when you would use Level 2 formatting. The only difference with that heading is that it is aligned to the left. Then, if the subsection itself has subsections within it, you would use Level 3 formatting, and so on. You may find that you get to Level 4 or 5 for very long papers, like your dissertation, but not really for shorter papers. Headings can be so useful for clear organization, so I really recommend that you visit the links I've given on the handout. You can even use headings to clearly show your professor that you've covered each component required by your assignment instructions. So for figures, you may have already noticed how I've been presenting my images or figures. They're numbered with a bolded figure number at the top, followed by an italicized title in title case. Underneath, a note is included to provide clarifying information and/or state where the figure came from. Tables are presented similarly, but with extra requirements about how to set up the table itself. It looks a little complicated, but we can break it down. A table is usually split into 2 types of columns. The first, leftmost column, is called a stub column. If you have no heading for this column, you can call it variable. Notice that the data under the heading in the stub column is left aligned. In contrast, the other columns are centered, especially when providing data. However, it is acceptable to left align the information in the other columns if you're presenting chunks of text, not data. You can choose to single space, 1.5 space, or double space the text in a table, depending on your needs and what you feel is most readable. You'll also notice that a horizontal line appears first at the top of the table below the title, second below the headings row, and third at the bottom of the table above any notes. Vertical lines are not used in APA tables. Different types of tables may have different recommended guidelines for these borders, however, so check the samples linked to on the handout. You could also ask your instructor if they require you to follow these strict guidelines, or if they're okay with a simpler table with both vertical and horizontal lines. The last thing that you don't see here is the double-spaced blank space above and below the table or figure to separate it seamlessly from the text. Let's say you have a question about formatting. How would you find the answer? I'll show you one way. Go to APA's website, which is extremely detailed and helpful. If you have a question, you'll likely find the answer under Style and Grammar Guidelines. Now this is a formatting question. I'm not sure how to space my document. So look under Paper Format, and then under Line Spacing. Line spacing is one of the pages available under Paper Format. Other sections you may use frequently include in-text citations and references for examples, and tables and figures for formatting reminders. Here's APA's answer to this question. In general, double space all parts of an APA-style paper, including the abstract, text, block quotations, table and figure numbers, titles and notes, and reference list, including between and within entries. Do not add extra space before or after paragraphs. That also applies to between references. Don't add extra space. Just allow the double spacing to do the work for you. If you have any questions about formatting, jot them down now, and you can always email us at the right site if you need a hand. Let's move on to in-text citations, because those are a very important part of APA style. We'll talk about the purpose of citing, as well as when to cite, what an in-text citation consists of, how to cite when paraphrasing and quoting, how to punctuate and format the citations. I'll go over some really important elements to be attentive to there, and how to cite different source types like journal articles or web pages. An in-text citation is a short citation given in the body of your writing that links to a full citation or reference at the end of the paper. So when it comes to citing, this helps you as a writer to give credit to others' ideas in a very clear way, and it makes it really easy for your readers to find the full source information on your references page. So the main purpose of documentation, along with practicing good academic integrity, is providing your reader with that path so they can go to the source and check it out themselves. You may find that you do this yourself when reading journal articles, using their in-text citations and references page to track down further sources that will help you in your research. To practice good academic integrity, you need to cite any instance where an outside idea has informed your writing, any idea that didn't generate from within you. Even if the idea did generate from within you, or from your personal experience, you may still want to find a reliable source to help you support your point. So be sure to cite when both paraphrasing and quoting, as well as when referring to data like statistics, and if you're reusing a table or figure. If you adapt a table or figure, you must state that when you cite it. And as a rule of thumb, I recommend citing attribution-free figures as well, which are those that the author has given permission to be used without citation. Technically, APA does not require a citation in this case, but you may want to show your instructor you've done your due diligence and aren't stealing images. When writing a research paper, you'll be citing a lot. You'll cite anything that is not your own point or argument, your own analysis or explanation of a piece of evidence. Argument and analysis are just as important to include as evidence, but make sure that you cite anything that is not your own idea or voice. So what is a citation made up of? Well, every citation answers crucial questions. APA uses the author date format, so citations answer who, the author, demonstrated by their last name, and when, the date in the form of year, or N period D period, an abbreviation for no date if no date is available. Who and when, the author date of the author date format, correspond to your reference list entry at the end of the paper to help your reader find the correct entry. If you're quoting, you're also going to provide where in the text you found the information. This is usually a page number, indicated by P period in the examples. Use a paragraph number if no page number is available. You can also see this in the example. Para period 3 for the paragraph number because no page number was available. Perhaps it was a web page. And as I said, where must be answered for quotes, but it's optional for paraphrasing. You may want to include a page number when paraphrasing for your own purposes of retracing your steps, or if your instructor asks you to. You'll be doing a lot of paraphrasing in your APA style papers. Paraphrasing means restating others' ideas in your own words. It's the way that you can incorporate ideas from sources or research, which is a key part of academic writing. Reasons you might paraphrase include describing ideas, maybe concepts or theories from other authors, emphasizing points important to your topic, like by adding evidence from studies, and drawing comparisons between authors' findings, so stating each author's finding and then discussing the similarities or differences. This last one would be very common in a literature review, for example. It's very important in disciplines that use APA, like nursing and psychology, to paraphrase as much as possible while minimizing direct quotes. As APA states, published authors paraphrase their sources most of the time, rather than directly quoting the sources. Student authors should emulate this practice by paraphrasing more than directly quoting. If you find you're quoting excessively, say more than one quote per page, you should challenge yourself to go back and paraphrase. If you're not confident with paraphrasing, we have a blog post about it, as well as a webinar. And you can also book an appointment with a writing coach at the Write site to go over strategies. The links to these are on our handout. Here's an example of paraphrasing to make the concept clearer. A direct quote from APA here is their definition of paraphrasing. A paraphrase restates another's idea, or your own previously published idea, in your own words. My paraphrase here changes the wording and structure of the original quote in order to say it in my own way. Paraphrasing is the strategy of restating others' ideas through different wording. There are two formats for citing when paraphrasing or quoting. One is called the narrative format, and that basically means that you're putting the citation into your sentence. It includes the author's name in your sentence, followed by the year in parentheses. Here is an example. According to APA 2021b, you can see the author, the name being embedded in your sentence in a signal phrase such as according to, followed by the year in parentheses. We also have parenthetical format, where all of the required information comes in parentheses at the end of the sentence. It can sometimes go in the middle, for example, if you're citing multiple sources, each in their own clause, separated perhaps by a comma or a semicolon, but it is usually going to come at the end. The parenthetical citation consists of the author, comma, year. Note the space between the author and the year. If you want to cite several sources at once because they have all provided the same information or come to the same conclusion, you can separate each citation with a semicolon. And here's an example of a parenthetical citation. Provide the paraphrase, followed by the citation in parentheses at the end of the sentence. Quoting also allows you to include an outside idea in your paper, but you do so by borrowing the exact wording and placing it in quotation marks. APA actually gives specific recommendations about when to quote instead of paraphrase. These include giving an exact definition, because it may be difficult to define terms precisely without quoting. You will likely want to quote when you want to respond to exact wording. This would be quite common if you're conversing with another author and you want to point to exact words of their argument that you agree or disagree with. Or you might quote when an author has said something memorably or particularly well. This is a tough one because we might think that it's memorable simply because we feel it was said better than we can say it. So try to challenge yourself to paraphrase even if you feel a quote is unique. Notice, there are not many circumstances under which quoting is recommended, so the default in APA is paraphrasing, though quoting can occasionally have its place. APA explains the benefits further, as paraphrasing allows you to fit material in the context of your paper and writing style, rather than a quote seeming very out of place. And how should you cite when quoting? Again, you can use narrative or parenthetical format. Just remember to include where the quote can be found. We've already got who and when, but we also want that extra information in case our reader wants to go and find the quote. So, you can use a page number if page numbers are available, format it as P period for one page, or PP period for page range if the quote starts on one page and ends on the next. In both these cases, P will be lowercase. Sometimes page numbers are not available, like on a web page. In this case, you can count backwards from the paragraph you're quoting to obtain a paragraph number. Use para, period, lowercase, for one paragraph, and paras, period, for a quote over multiple paragraphs. Though I think that would be rare because it would be quite long, and we'll talk more about lengthy quotes in a few minutes. If a web page or other unpaginated source has a heading or section name, you could use that instead. Give the section name with each major word capitalized, then the word section with a lowercase s. You can even give the section name and the number of the paragraph in the section if you want to be very meticulous. Just separate them with a comma and a space. This could be useful if you want to revisit the quote yourself at some point. So the example is short quotations section, comma, space, para, period, space 3. For an audio or video source, provide a timestamp. Colons separate hours, minutes, and seconds. 1:16:35. For a PowerPoint slide deck, provide the slide number with the word slide capitalized. For classical or religious works, you would provide the numbered parts, such as chapter and verse number. So, even if there is no page number, there is always a way to show where the quote came from in the source. Here are some examples. This first one shows narrative format, with the author and date embedded in the grammar of the sentence, followed by the quote. APA 2021D explains to the quote, and then a parenthetical citation is given at the end to show where the quote came from. We have a section name, followed by a comma and a paragraph number. This second example shows parenthetical format, with the quote itself integrated into the grammar of the sentence, which is important to avoid a floating quote that isn't anchored to the ideas in your paper. Then the quote is followed by the author, date, and page number in parentheses. Note also that the period for the sentence comes after the citation, not before. It's like the citation is part of the sentence. Block quotations are used when the quotation you've chosen is 40 words or more. Like quoting itself, block quotations should be very rare, even more rare. Make sure there is a very good reason you've chosen this entire lengthy quote to include, and ensure that you analyze it in depth. Don't let it speak for itself, or your reader could be lost as to its purpose in the paper. Be very wary of including more than one per paper, especially for undergraduate papers or short papers, as opposed to the thesis or dissertation. Otherwise, it could seem like you're handing over the paper to other authors and avoiding focusing on your own contributions. Some formatting requirements to be aware of include, once again, integrating the quote. Don't let it float by itself. And here you can see that with an explanation of the quote leading into the quote, followed by a colon, which is used to introduce the quote. The entire quote is indented, which is done in lieu of quotation marks. So as you can see, there are no quotation marks with a block quotation. And another difference from a standard quote is that the period comes before the citation instead of after it. You may have noticed in the examples of narrative citations we've seen, including author and date in your sentence, that a certain phrasing is used to introduce the author and year. These are sometimes called signal phrases. They can help you properly embed a quote into the grammar of your sentence. Here are some examples of signal phrases that you can try. There's also a link to a list of signal phrase verbs on the handout. Here, for example, you can see the signal phrase verbs explain, mention, and found. These are all verbs that show the action of the author or researcher and can help you begin a narrative citation, as in Benson et al. 2019 found that sometimes to make a quote fit the grammar of your sentence, you might need to alter it slightly. For example, you may want to change the first letter to uppercase or lowercase to match your sentence. Similarly, you may want to change the punctuation at the end of the quote. for example, exchanging a comma for a period. These changes can be made as long as the meaning of the quote doesn't change. If quotation marks appear in the quote, you'll want to use single quotation marks for the inside quote. And you can also omit footnotes from the quote. Here's an example of an original quote from APA 2022 about changes to quotes. Some changes can be made to direct quotations without alerting readers. And you can see in the changed quote that the capital letter has been changed to a small letter, and the colon has been replaced with a period. These changes can be done without marking them in any way. Other reasons you might change a quote include omitting words, such as to make a passage shorter and avoid a block quotation. For this change, use an ellipsis or 3 dots with a space between each one. You might also want to add or change words to make the quote fit the grammar of the sentence. In this case, place the added or changed word in square brackets. The square brackets can be found on the keyboard beside the letter P. Use square brackets again if you want to add explanation of what a term means, and use the phrase emphasis added in square brackets after italicizing words for emphasis. You should also mark any errors in the text, such as a spelling error or the use of racist or sexist language. Use the italicized word seek in square brackets directly after the error. Seek means so or thus in Latin, to show that the error was thus in the original. It is not an error you made in transcribing the quote. Here's what the changes can look like in the text. We have a change of word in square brackets. We have an ellipsis, dot space, dot space, dot, to omit some words. We have emphasis added in square brackets after italicizing some words, and seek in square brackets to note the error. When you're punctuating your in-text citations, I want you to pay attention to lots of little details around punctuation and spacing. Here are the main items to watch for. Parentheses, of course, as well as commas between who, when, and where, and periods, ampersands, and semicolons. Here's a narrative citation. Joseph and Handy, 2016, stated, where we have parentheses around the year. Here's a parenthetical citation, Brown, 2005, where we've got the parentheses around the author and the year, plus a comma between the author and year, and a period after the citation rather than after the sentence itself. Here's an example of an integrated quote with Brown, 2005, page 127. Who, when, and where are separated by commas, and P period space indicates the abbreviation for page number. Here's an example with multiple sources in one citation. A semicolon space separates the two, and we've got a couple of new items in this citation. The ampersand between two authors' names, whereas if this was in your sentence, you would write out the word and, A-N-D. And then over here we have et al, followed by a period, which abbreviates the Latin term et alia, meaning and others. There's the period. Notice this period is after al because it's short for alia, but et is a full word meaning and, so it has no period. Et al period. The comma is there because it's the normal comma between who and when. You should use et al with any source that has more than two authors. All you have to put in the in-text citation is the first author's last name, followed by et al. You'll name all of the other authors up to 20 in your reference. This differs from the previous rule in APA 6 that required 3 to 5 authors to be written out the first time you mention the source. APA 6 also had different restrictions for author number in the references. But that's not all. We also want to pay attention to capitalization, quotation marks, and font particulars. There are so many things to remember, I acknowledge that, and that's why I wanted to emphasize that you can go to APA Style website, as well as the Purdue OWL website to help you double check these details. Double check your capitalization based on source type and type of title, whether article title or journal title. Double check which items should be given in quotation marks or italicized. These are things that I double check when working with students because they're so easy to forget. Use the tools that are there, just as I do, and it will start to come with practice. In some cases, you may want to give the title of the article in the text, such as in this example. In the article, Leadership is a Conversation, Groisberg and Slind, 2009, argue that. Here we see title case capitalization. All of the major words are capitalized. This is true only when you use the article name in the text. For shorter works like articles or chapters, we'll also use double quotation marks around the title, again, only when given in text, not in the reference. Standalone sources like books will also use title case capitalization, as in this example. In her groundbreaking book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, Klein 2014 reveals that. This will also use title case capitalization for the title, but it's indicated with italics. An odd thing to note here is that APA considers web pages standalone and italicizes them. I don't quite understand that because a web page is part of a website and thus not standalone, but maybe they'll address that in a later revision. A common question is how to cite a source when you're summarizing or paraphrasing it for several sentences in a row. It may seem at first glance that you need to cite every sentence, but this isn't always the case if you use APA's long paraphrase guidelines. Start by introducing the source, including an in-text citation, usually narrative, such as Velez et al. 2018 found that, which we'll see on the next slide. You're then free to summarize or paraphrase the author's points for the remainder of the paragraph without reciting. Note that this would exclude your own analysis. You must only be paraphrasing or summarizing the source itself in order to use this method. So when paraphrasing a source for several sentences, you do not need to cite every sentence. Cite only the first sentence that introduces the source. But double check that it is clear throughout all the sentences that the information comes from that source. We'll see this in the example. If you insert your own analysis, use another source, or start a new paragraph, you will need to recite the source the next time you use it. In this example, you can see the long paraphrase in action. The source is introduced in the first sentence, with Velez et al. 2018 found that. It's then paraphrased for several sentences with no additional citations. This is a suitable method here because it's clear throughout that the information comes from the source. The paraphrase continually discusses the findings of the source, and even uses that terminology in the last sentence here. These findings underscore. There's also no insertion of analysis or use of another source, and the paraphrase is all contained within one paragraph. You can see that this long paraphrases guideline prevents the unnecessary repetition of citations, which can interrupt the flow of the writing. It's really a handy thing to know and to use when possible for readability. And I encourage you to visit APA's paraphrasing webpage, which we've linked to in our references, and on this slide to review this and more about paraphrasing. If you find that you're stuck with how to cite a source, keep in mind that APA is an author-date format, and each in-text citation gives the who and the when. This part is easy to memorize. Some types of sources have their own rules or exceptions though, so you may find that you want to double-check things like unknown author. In this case, it is correct to use the title in place of the author in your citation. Secondary sources. When you would like to cite a source that you found within another source, Include the original source's author and date, along with the phrase "as cited in," followed by the secondary source's citation. A reference is not required for the original source, only for the source you have in front of you. Here is an example: Somerville 2007, as cited in Scully 2012. Somerville 2007 is the original source that Scully is citing. Notice the comma before "as cited in," which is an easy detail to miss. I'll say that this should be done sparingly according to APA. Best practice is to track down the original source. However, sometimes this is not always practical or possible, so the secondary source method exists to fill that gap. You can read more about citing via secondary sources at our Dear Right Cite blog post mentioned on the handout. And a final non-standard source type, important to note for in-text citations, is the personal communication. This could be a personal email, conversation, or other communication that you personally had with someone else. APA explains, because readers cannot retrieve the information in personal communications are not included in the reference list. They're cited in the text only. Give the initials and surname of the communicator and provide as exact a date as possible. So here's an example. C period space Joseph, so C Joseph, comma, personal communication, comma, December 7th, 2020. This will come at the end of the sentence that paraphrases or quotes this other person. You can see the exception right away. The first initial, C, followed by the last name, Joseph. Then you give an identification of the source type as personal communication, followed by the date. Try to keep a record when communicating with your source so that you can provide the date as well as an accurate reflection of their idea, and ensure you obtain their permission to use the idea. APA also provides specific guidelines for citing traditional knowledge or oral traditions of Indigenous peoples. When using any traditional knowledge or oral traditions, whether recorded or unrecorded, APA acknowledges it is essential to maintain the integrity of Indigenous perspectives. Firstly, the source of the information must be considered for accuracy and respect, because many recorded sources have engaged in appropriation and degradation. Secondly, permission must often be sought and protocols followed for the use of traditional knowledge. For example, as APA notes, some stories are told only at certain times of year or by certain people, and so should not be used. Recorded sources that can be accessed by others are cited and referenced like any other source. However, a variation of the personal communication is used for information that has not been recorded. Of course, the person's permission must be obtained to use the information they shared, as well as their personal details. The personal details to include are the source's full name, first and last, their nation, and their location. This captures a fuller identity of the person to place them within the context of their Indigenous community. Be sure to include the words personal communication and the date as well. Like with other personal communications, however, a corresponding reference is not given. In response to this, alternative guidelines were developed by librarian Larissa McLeod and colleagues at Norquest College in Edmonton. These guidelines treat Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers as equal to published sources of information by adding them as a new author category. The source's last name is used for the in-text citation, while the reference includes such information as nation or community, treaty territory if applicable, location, and topic of discussion. The act of including a reference for traditional knowledge brings more deserved credibility to the source and removes the inequitable privileging of textual sources of information compared to oral. So please review both links given on the handout and ask your professor if you would like to use the alternative guidelines that bring additional respect and acknowledgement to oral traditions and Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers. We're getting to the end of our long section on in-text citations. So here's what in-text citations look like in the body of your text. We've got parenthetical citations like Trachtenberg 2008, page 850. The author, followed by the year, followed by the page number, all in parentheses at the end of a sentence. And we've got some narrative citations here where the citation is presented within the grammar of the sentence. For example, Holden Lund, 1988, examined. You'll notice that the author Holden Lund is mentioned later on without a year, and this is because this passage uses the long paraphrase guideline that I mentioned. Also notice that there is only one quote in the paragraph, and you might consider it a good rule of thumb to include no more than one quote per paragraph when using APA style. Only use a quote if strictly necessary. Take a moment to jot down which questions are coming up for you about citations. Think about whether you prefer narrative or parenthetical citations. In my opinion, using a mix is ideal for variation in sentence structure. Before we move on to our references section, let's answer some questions and do some practice citations. First, true or false? The purpose of in-text citations is to give credit to others' ideas in a clear way. Would that be true or false? That's true. The purpose of in-text citations is to give credit to others' ideas in a clear way. True or false? A citation answers the questions of who, when, and sometimes where. That would also be true. Finally, I only ever need to cite others' ideas once per paragraph. Is that true or false? This is a tricky one. It's actually false. There are some situations where you can cite others' ideas only once per paragraph, such as if you use APA's long paraphrase guidelines, but these are very specific guidelines, so make sure you follow them carefully. Otherwise, you need to cite ideas anytime you mention them from another source. And here's a practice citation. We'll work through this one together. The article information says, Indigenous knowledge in post-secondary educators' practices, nourishing the learning spirit. Then it says Jonathan Anuik, University of Alberta, Carmen L. Gillies, University of Saskatchewan. It says Canadian Journal of Higher Education, Volume 42, Number 1, 2012, pages 63 to 79. Which would be the correct narrative citation? Would it be as stated by Anuik and Gillies 2012? No, this one's incorrect because it does not place the year in parentheses. Would this one be correct? According to Anuik and Gillies, placing 2012 at the end of the sentence. This is incorrect because it uses an ampersand and places the year at the end of the sentence instead of after the author's names. What about this? Anuik and Gillies 2012 argued that. It's correct. The narrative citation uses and written out between two authors' names. It also places the year in parentheses after the author's names. How about this last one? Jonathan and Carmen explain. This is incorrect. It uses the author's first names and omits the year. Note that the authors are stated in the order they are presented on the article. Anuik, then Gillies. Now this one I'll let you figure out on your own. There is only one correct answer. The article information says, decolonization, reinhabitation, and reconciliation, Aboriginal and place-based education. Alexa Scully, Lakehead University, Canada. Canadian Journal of Environmental Education, 17, 2012. Is it A. Scully, 2012, page 150? Is it Scully and Lakehead, 2012, page 150? Is it Decolonization, Reinhabitation, and Reconciliation, 2012, page 150? Or is it Scully, 2012, page 150? The first is incorrect because it includes the author's first initial. The second is incorrect because it mistakes the author's institution as an author. The third is incorrect because it uses a title when the author name is available. And the fourth is correct. Notice how simple and straightforward the author date format is. Scully, 2012, page 150. Now let's try coming up with our own citations. Here we have a source that has 3 authors. Contract Cheating and Blackmail, A Risky Business? Jonathan York, Leslie Sefcik, and Teresha Viren-Colton. Pages 53 to 66, published online 25 Feb 2020. It also has a DOI. Now first, if you can't remember how to format a source with 3+ authors, where could you find that answer? Go to Purdue OWL, click on Research and Citation, followed by APA Style, APA Formatting and Style Guide, getting more specific here with in-text citations, author/authors, and scroll down to the example, a work by 3 or more authors. And this is what you'll find. List only the first author's name followed by et al. Period in every citation, even the first, unless doing so would create ambiguity between different sources. Now take a moment to create your in-text citation for this article. And now I'll show you my in-text citation. York et al. Period, comma, 2020. Notice that formatting of et al., the period at the end, not after et, and the comma between the author and the year, along with the period after the citation. Here's a web page with an unknown author. Integrity, from Longman Dictionary of Contemporary English. And then it gives the definition of integrity. So first, if you don't know how to cite this, where could you go? It's the same page as before. Note that this page also includes exactly how to cite an organizational author, which is common with websites, 2 or more works at once, works by the same author in the same year, and so on. So this Purdue OWL link is a very helpful one. For an unknown author, we learn, when the work does not have an author, move the title of the work to the beginning of the references and follow with the date of publication. This example also has an unknown date, so consider how that should be formatted. And now I'll show you my in-text citation. Integrity, comma, ND for no date. Note the periods for the abbreviation, N period, D period. And integrity is capitalized and italicized as a web page title. What if we have a personal communication? Well, first, there should be a place that you can look for the answer. Check out the APA Style webpage. Click Style and Grammar Guidelines, followed by in-text citations, personal communications, and scroll down to Citing Personal Communications in the text. On this webpage, we learn start with the author, including the first initial and last name, then give the phrase personal communication, followed by as exact a date as possible. The in-text citations page also provides instructions on citing quotes from research subjects and secondary sources, so this is also a very helpful page. How would you cite a personal communication? Now I'll show you my example. C period space Joseph, or C Joseph, comma, personal communication, comma, December 7th, 2020. All in parentheses, ending on a period. We're getting to the home stretch here. For references, we'll discuss, again, their purpose, what a reference list entry consists of, how to punctuate and format entries, what a references page looks like, and what to do if you're not sure. So what is the purpose of references? The purpose of references is to give further detail about sources than in-text citations allow. It just wouldn't be efficient to put all the information into the text, so having a page of corresponding references is an effective solution. And of course, that further detail makes it even easier for your reader to find your sources themselves. With the extra details references give, they actually answer more questions than the who, when answered by the citations. Again, we have who, the author, and when, the year in the reference entry. And these items correspond to the author date format of the in-text citation so that your reader can find the correct reference quickly. In addition, the references include what, the title, and where the source itself can be found. You might think of this as the publication information. However, the particular page or paragraph number of a quote is not provided as it is in the in-text citation. And you can see this in our example of a reference for a book. Brown C. 2005, Learning Styles, a Resource Book for Teachers, Macmillan. Now another thing that differs from the in-text citation is that we're including the author's first initials in the who spot. Then we also have the year, when, the title, what, and the publisher, where. Notice that in a reference, each item of who, when, what, and where is separated by a period. And note that sometimes where is separated into multiple items. For example, the hyperlinked URL follows a period after the rest of the where. Here are the punctuation marks to pay attention to when you're punctuating your reference list entries. Again, we've got the parentheses, the commas, and the periods. We've also got the colon this time, as well as the good old ampersand. Here's an example. Adzuki B, 2002, a review of studies in educational psychology from 1990 to 2000. In C. Chowdhury and I. Chakrabarty eds. Educational Psychology, pages 55 to 63, Houghton Mifflin. This time parentheses are not only used around the year, but also around notes that identify the editors and the page range for a chapter in a book. We've got our typical commas as between the author's last name and initials. We use a period to punctuate the initials. And we've also got our periods between the items of who, when, what, and where, as well as to show other abbreviations like eds, period, for editors. Here's a second example. Anuik J. and Gillies C.L., 2012. Indigenous Knowledge in Post-Secondary Educators' Practices, Nourishing the Learning Spirit. Canadian Journal of Higher Education, 42, 1, 63 to 79, followed by the DOI. Now, parentheses are used around a journal article's issue number. Note that no parentheses are used for the page range in an article as they were in the book chapter. And notice the comma between separate author names, even two author names, which is unlike the in-text citations, which only contain the ampersand or and written out between the author's last names. We also have commas between the different sub-elements of where, including the journal title, the volume and issue, and the page range. Finally, notice that no period is included after a URL or DOI, and the URL or DOI should be hyperlinked. A hint is that you can simply add https://doi.org/ in front of any DOI to produce the link. What else is important when formatting references? You'll also want to pay attention to spacing, capitalization, font, and alphabetization. Here's our first example. Albertson J, 2000, the greatest comic book hero ever. Popular culture, 51-3, 23-40. In this first example, notice that you always want a space to come after a period or a comma, like with the author's name. For capitalization, remember how we used title case capitalization for article titles when they're given in text? The opposite is true for the references page. Now we're using what we call sentence case, capitalizing the first letter of the title and the subtitle, if there is one, as well as proper names. But the rest is lowercase, like a sentence. Also notice the title case capitalization for the journal title. Both popular and culture are capitalized. In terms of font, we're going to use italics for larger sources like journal titles, and even the volume number. Here's a second example. Klein N, 2014. This changes everything. Capitalism versus the climate. Simon & Schuster. Here you'll notice that the title of the book is also in italics. However, in contrast to the journal title, the book title is in sentence case, with capitalization only at the beginning of the title and the subtitle, or used for proper nouns. Notice also that the references are alphabetized by last name, going from A to Z, with A at the top of the references page and Z at the bottom. Here are some examples of references for common source types. Journal article. Benson L, Rodier K, Enstrom R, and Bocato E, 2019. Developing a university-wide academic integrity e-learning tutorial, a Canadian case. International Journal for Educational Integrity, 15-5, 1-23, followed by the DOI. Book. Grant R.M. and Jordan J., 2015. Foundations of Strategy, 2nd edition, Wiley. Reports. Canadian Nurses Association, 2017. Climate Change and Health, followed by the URL. And a web page. Canadian Nurses Association, ND, Racism in Healthcare, followed by the URL. Notice the similarity between reports and web pages. Often reports are downloadable PDFs, while a web page consists of the page you see in your browser. Let's take a quick peek at what a references page looks like. Note that the references begin on a new page, and I'll show you how to do this on the next slide. Again, we've got the bold, centered heading, and we're still continuing our page numbers. We're also using what's called a hanging indent for each entry. The first line of an entry is not indented, it's left aligned, but every subsequent line of that reference is indented. And I'll show you how to do this in a couple of slides. Some students sometimes don't realize that the references should actually begin on a new page after your conclusion, so don't place them on the same page as your text. Instead, use a page break to begin a new page, then add the bolded and centered references heading. You can attain a page break by clicking on the Insert tab in Word. The very first section on the ribbon that appears is Pages, and page break is one of the options. The keyboard shortcut is Control-Enter. These instructions are on our handout. If you don't use a page break, If you go back and add text or remove text while editing, the references section will move around and will no longer begin at the top of a page. However, a page break tells the document that the references should always begin on a new page. If you add another page of text, the references page will just jump down to a new page, which is exactly what you want. To achieve the hanging indent required, go to the paragraph settings by clicking the arrow in the right-hand corner of the paragraph section. A box pops up with options for indents and spacing. Under Indentation, and then Special, you can choose Hanging from the drop-down menu. You don't need to change the default size in the box beside it, where you see 0.83 centimeters. Just leave that as is, and these instructions for hanging indent are on the handout. There are so many source types. Don't expect to memorize them all. I don't have them all memorized. You can use the resources listed on our handout under References to help you find the correct format. Once you find an example, pay attention to the different elements we've talked about, like what punctuation is used and where. What you can memorize is the basic format of who, when, what, then where. Some sources will be unique, and you won't be able to find an example that covers it exactly. Use the closest source type you can as a guideline. Sometimes you have to cobble something together, and that's okay, as long as you're doing your due diligence to provide the information you know is typically required: who, when, what, and where, with the punctuation requirements we've talked about. Here are some examples of non-standard sources that have unique requirements. News articles and blog posts should include the month and day with the reference: year, month, day. If you're using course content provided by your institution, then list the author's name if provided, or if you cannot find an author's name, the name of the institution will do. For example, for AU students citing their Brightspace or Moodle content, you can use Athabasca University as the author, if not otherwise listed. Kara at the Right site has written a comprehensive blog post on how to cite various course materials in APA, and you can access it on our handout. I highly recommend it for several specific examples. A web page created not by an individual but an organization, like a school, a nonprofit, or a government agency, should use the organization name under Who. Or, if the author is completely unknown, use the title for Who with sentence case capitalization. Under Where, you can give the website name, for example, inettutor.com. It's not a known organization, but it's the name of the website. You can also use the resources on our handout under Bonus, the tough questions, at the bottom to help you with the trickier questions. We've already covered some of this, but here's an overview of what to do when a source is missing certain required information. You can come back to this slide if you're stuck. For example, if it doesn't have a listed author, use the title in place of the author. We've already covered what to do if no date is listed, ND. And if there is no title, which may happen occasionally with images, for example, provide a description of the source in square brackets. Here's our first example: English tenses, ND, englishhilfen.de, followed by the URL. This is a web page with no author and no date. The italicized web page title is given in place of an author's name, and N period, D period is in place of the date. And our second example, Monterosso D, 2014, Teddy Bear Reading a Book, teddysgalore.org, followed by the URL. This second example shows an image with no title. A description is given in square brackets instead of a title: Teddy Bear Reading a Book. And here's a challenge for us. Pause the video and go to this URL, libguides.royalroads.ca/4feathers. See if you can find the information that you need to create a reference of a web page with an organizational author. Did you find who? It's Royal Roads University. When? It's 2022. You can use an updated date instead of a created date if both are listed, but do not use a copyright date for web pages. What is it? Four Feathers Writing Guide. Where? Royal Roads University. Plus, you'll also need the URL. And here's the reference, Royal Roads University, 2022, Four Feathers Writing Guide, followed by the URL. And here's another challenge for you about Athabasca University course materials, how to create the reference. I've given some images here that show the information for the course. LMOC 551, August 2023. Leading People Through Organizational Change, August 7, 2023. It also says External Forces for Change. Development and Production Team. Course author, Karen Somerville, PhD. Academic Area Manager, Teresa Rose, PhD. Learning Designer and Editor, Janet Thompson, BA, LLB. So who is our who? It's Somerville K, or Athabasca University if you cannot find an individual author. When? 2023. What? External Forces for Change. Where? Athabasca University. Plus the URL. So here's our final reference. Somerville K, 2023. External Forces for Change. Athabasca University, followed by the URL. However, you can use the institution as author if you can't find the individual course authors. Athabasca University, 2023. External Forces for Change. URL. I also like to download the PDF of all the course materials. This prevents you from having to cite the same author, same date for multiple sources, such as multiple pages of the course. Instead, you can just cite the single document and provide a page number or section name, like this. Somerville K, 2023. LMOC 551, Leading People Through Organizational Change. PDF in square brackets. Athabasca University, followed by the URL. Remember to check out Kara's awesome blog post on our Dear Right Site blog, all about this topic. And now let's try a journal article with a volume and issue number. This will be a very common source for research in most courses. It says Indigenous Knowledge in Post-Secondary Educators' Practices, Nourishing the Learning Spirit. Jonathan Anuik, University of Alberta. Carmen L. Gillies, University of Saskatchewan. Canadian Journal of Higher Education, Volume 42, Number 1, 2012, pages 63 to 79. Can you identify who? It's Anuik J. and Gillies C.L. How about when? 2012. Do you know what "what" is in this case? It's Indigenous Knowledge in Post-Secondary Educators' Practices, Nourishing the Learning Spirit. And what would be our where information for this article? Canadian Journal of Higher Education, Volume 42, Number 1, pages 63 to 79. And here's our reference. Anuik J. and Gillies C.L. 2012. Indigenous Knowledge in Post-Secondary Educators' Practices, Nourishing the Learning Spirit. Canadian Journal of Higher Education, 42, 1, 63 to 79. Now how about this book? Once again, let's identify who, when, what, and where to create our reference. It says author, Di Carvalho, Roy Jose. Title: The Founders of Humanistic Psychology. Roy Jose de Carvalho. Foreword by Stanley Krippner. Publisher, New York, Prager, 1991. Call number: BF 204.D291, 1991. Location: main collection. Repeats the call number. Status: in library. Who is de Carvalho, R.J.? When is 1991? What? The founders of humanistic psychology. Where? Prager, the publisher. Now, can you put all of these together to create your reference for a book? I'll show you mine. De Carvalho, R.J., 1991. The Founders of Humanistic Psychology. Prager. You may use ebooks more often than you use books these days. This one also has editors and translators, so watch for that information, and there will be a certain way to include it as well. The ebook information is Young, C.G., Carl Gustav, 1875 to 1961. Kindertraum, English. Children's Dreams, electronic resource. Notes from the seminar given in 1936 to 1940 by C.G. Young, edited by Lorenz Young and Maria Meyer-Grass, translated by Ernst Falzeder with the collaboration of Tony Wolfson. Princeton, Oxford, Princeton University Press, 2008. Our who or author is Young, C.G. Our when or date is 2008. Our what is Children's Dreams, notes from the seminar given in 1936 to 1940, but we have additional information pertaining to the what. Editors L. Young and M. Meyer-Grass, and translators E. Falzeder and T. Wolfson. Where is Princeton University Press, plus the URL. Here's the reference I came up with. Young, C.G., 2008. Children's Dreams, notes from the seminar given in 1936 to 1940. L. Young and M. Meyer-Grass, eds. E. Falzeder and T. Wolfson, trans. Princeton University Press, followed by the URL. Some of those were pretty challenging. So where should you go for answers? If you're stuck on how to do a reference or citation for a certain source type, or have an APA formatting question, where should you look? Start with the APA website, which is excellent. We've already seen its usefulness, as well as the usefulness of Purdue OWL. Though I'll mention that Purdue OWL does have the very occasional mistake. It also has a citation generator that looks like it's part of it, but it's really an advertisement, so watch for that. The APA 6th edition archive is quite good for finding answers to obscure APA questions. Because this resource was built over so many years, it is extremely comprehensive. I still occasionally recommend checking it if the APA 7 blog doesn't have the answer yet. Much of the information will still be relevant. You can also contact APA if you've checked everywhere else, and they will get back to you. A student told me she tested this and she was successful, and since then I have been too. You can also email the right site, even before you contact APA, of course, and we'll do our best to help you find an answer. Finally, the publication manual is recommended for graduate students, and I recommend the Concise Guide to APA Style for undergraduate students. Take a moment to jot down any final questions or thoughts. What stood out to you most about referencing, or any other part of the presentation? If you're feeling stuck on anything, you can always email us at writesite@athabascau.ca. That's WRITESITE@athabascau.ca. You can also use the resources I showed on the previous slide, which are all linked to you on our handout. You can find our handout linked to below, in our summary. We look forward to talking to you. I'll show you our references next.